Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the second day of Norwich University's 7th Peace and War Summit on Africa, in person or online. My name is Yang-Mo Koo, Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of the Peace and War Center at Norwich University. I am truly honored and grateful for the opportunity to serve as the Executive Director of the 2026 Africa Summit. Yesterday, Ambassador Edris of the African Union as a keynote speaker and 9 leading scholars and 3 Norwich students shared their unique insights on a variety of key African issues. This morning, we will host 2 roundtable discussions. The first session will explore the complexities and challenges in Africa, while the second will focus on great power rivalry and U.S. strategy toward the African region. Dr. Emily Gray will lead the first roundtable discussion. Let me introduce her briefly. Dr. Emily Fisher-Gray received a PhD in early modern European history from the University of Pennsylvania and has taught at Norwich University for the past 18 years. Her research interests include religious diversity and conflict in the German land and the impact of war on churches and other cultural sites and the process of peacemaking. She is currently completing a textbook on the 1648 Peace of Westphalia. Now, I turn it over to Dr. Gray. Let us give her a round of applause.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? I'd like to, I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you, Dr. Koo, for the opportunity to sit at a table with these distinguished scholars and have an opportunity to really talk about some challenging and exciting issues that are happening in Africa right now. I'd like to introduce the panelists, and then I have some questions for them that we can talk about. And then we will have some time at the end for you all to ask questions. So as we're speaking, as the panelists are speaking, I hope that you will be thinking about the questions that you would love to have answered by these experts. So let me just tell you who we have here at the table. So on my left, on your immediate right, is Mr. Rashid Sow. Mr. Rashid Sow. Who is a global education professional and political science scholar specializing in conflict prevention, human security, and international engagement. He's originally from the Côte d'Ivoire. He brings a transnational perspective shaped by personal experiences and work across West Africa and the United States. Rashid holds a Master of Arts in International Negotiation and Conflict Resolution from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Global Studies from Endicott College. His academic and professional interests include civilian protection, gender and political violence, humanitarian policy, and human rights advocacy. He currently serves as program coordinator in the Global Education Department at Endicott College, where he supports institutional internationalization and the academic and cultural integration of international students, particularly from Central and South Asia. As an experienced educator, Rashid has taught in both West Africa and the United States, advancing cross-cultural competence and global leadership, fluent in French, English, and Bambara, with working proficiency in Spanish. He is committed to advancing inclusive global education and strengthening institutions that promote peace and human dignity. Next to him, we have Dr. Ebenezer Obadare, who is a Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies on the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., and a fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Theology. Before joining CFR, he was a professor of sociology at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. Obadare is the author of numerous works on civil society and the state and religion and politics in Africa, including most recently Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender, and Sexuality in Nigeria. He has written for Foreign Affairs, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, The Free Press, and The Globe and Mail, among others. He was editor of the Journal of Modern African Studies and is a contributing editor to Current History. His forthcoming book, The Nigerian Paradox, will be published by Oxford University Press. Next to him, we have Dr. Claudine Kuradasenga McLeod, a Rwandan scholar and the 2023 Harry Frank Guggenheim Distinguished Scholar, whose work sits at the intersection of genocide studies, conflict analysis and resolution, and diaspora studies. Her research examines how narratives of mass violence, transnationalism, and identity shape diasporic experiences in the United States and Europe, and particular attention to historical trauma and identity politics. Her first book, The Narratives of Victimhood and Perpetration, The Struggle of Bosnian and Rwandan Diaspora Communities in the United States, offers a comparative analysis of survival narratives and contested identities within Bosnian and Rwandan diaspora communities. Her scholarship has appeared in leading journals, including the Journal of Genocide Research, Genocide Studies and Prevention, International Journal, Diaspora, a Journal of Transnational Studies, the International Journal of Transitional Justice, and International Studies Review. And finally, there on the end, Dr. Jonathan Morse, an associate professor of political science at the University of Connecticut and a previous Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Dr. Morse's research concerns institutional development and regime outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, with an emphasis on mixed methods research and the qualitative case study tradition. He is currently completing a book manuscript titled Discovering Welfare, the Politics of Social Protection in Africa, which investigates the political and historical roots of new efforts to expand pensions, health insurance, and cash transfers in Africa. His previous book, How Autocrats Compete, Parties, Patrons, and Unfair Elections in Africa, examined the phenomenon of electoral authoritarianism in Africa. So we have quite a panel here in front of us. What I'd like to do is I read a question, and then you all can decide in what order you wish to answer it. Go ahead and jump in if you have an answer. These are hard questions, though, so you know they're exam questions, right? They're dissertation questions. But we're excited to hear from you about what you think about this. So the first question that I have for the panel is a question about governance and democratic backsliding. Recent years have seen a wave of military coups across the Sahel, persistent electoral contestation in West Africa, and debates about competitive authoritarianism across the continent. So the question is this: to what extent are these developments symptoms of a deeper legitimacy crisis in African states? And what role, if any, should external actors play in supporting democratic norms without reproducing paternalistic or neo-colonial dynamics? Panel, what do you think?
Okay, so I guess I'll start with this. Can people hear me? These are $1 million questions, so if any of us has the one answer, right, they should win the Genius Award. Maybe I'll do like a little table setting first and let other people kind of jump in, because it's a multifaceted question about what is the landscape of democratic governance right now in Africa, what are the underlying causes of this kind of democratic landscape, and what role do international actors like the United States play. And I think we could do it in two ways. We can sort of take like a snapshot, but also look at trends when thinking of democratic governance. So in sort of a snapshot, Africa is home to a diverse, different kinds of regimes. We have clear, more stable democracies in countries like South Africa, and countries like Namibia, in Botswana. We have countries that have appeared to stabilize certain elements of electoral democracy over the past 25 years in Ghana, in Senegal, and in Malawi, perhaps. And then we have a lot of countries that are kind of what we call in kind of the gray zone sometimes. They stagger between kind of authoritarianism and democracy. And I'm thinking of countries like Nigeria. I'm thinking of countries like Kenya. And then we have countries that are what we might call electoral authoritarian, too. Like, again, lots of different types of outcomes here. And sort of the clearest example of a country that I study a lot is like a country like Cameroon, for instance, that has had the same president since 1983. Elections are highly tilted in their favor. There's high levels of repression and restrictions on civil liberties and political rights. And then we also have a number of countries that you might call closed type of regimes, a growth of military regimes across the Sahel, from sort of Mali to Burkina Faso, which is a new trend of the past few years. And so you get this diversity of regimes, so it means they have different underlying causes and factors that are shaping them. In terms of trends, the trends over the past decade have point to kind of, again, two different kind of directions. Is, again, democratic consolidation in a number of countries, but also decline in democratic quality even in countries that are already kind of authoritarian. We call it autocratization, kind of in the lingo, that countries are becoming more autocratic, more restrictive. I think of a country like Tanzania, that after this last election last year cracked down very, very hard on opposition protests. It was a very contentious election where the president claimed to have won 95% of the vote. And a sort of a pattern of behavior that was not typical of Tanzania 15 years ago. And then another kind of trend is, again, you see this in some of the data. I just looked it up sort of in Afrobarometer that was mentioned as like a polling endeavor yesterday by one of the panelists, is that if you look at, Africans are really good at assessing the state of their own democracy, right? The way kind of experts from the outside code countries actually corresponds pretty strongly to how Africans themselves view the supply of democracy in their country. But what's really declined is satisfaction with democracy. Even in the more kind of consolidated systems where we don't think democracy is necessarily going to break down anytime soon, but there's still declining satisfaction with democracy. Like if we look at the way they phrase the question, are you highly satisfied or very satisfied in democracy? I think the average was 39% across Africa. But again, it varies a lot. So it's a little higher in a country like Ghana, again, more of an established democracy. It's much lower in a country like Mozambique, which is more of an electoral authoritarian kind of nudging on the gray zone type of regime. And that's been declining. So those numbers have been declining a lot over the past 10 years. And so I could stop here and move to other panels, but like the underlying kind of trends here, again, these are complicated, multifaceted questions. One of the drivers of this dissatisfaction is sort of the failure to kind of have real transformative politics towards something that looks like democracy in certain countries, right? There is a trend of authoritarianism, but there's also a sense that even in the countries where democracy is more consolidated, it's not performing well. It's not delivering to citizens' need. It's not responsive enough. And that's creating, the question was, are these symptoms of a deeper legitimacy crisis in African states? And I would say, across the board, pretty much yes, right? There's a strong crisis of faith in elite leadership, particularly from younger generations. We talked about the demographic dividend a bit yesterday as well, and that's driving a lot of it. So maybe I'll stop here to get some other opinions before we turn to like the role of external actors or something like that. But that's sort of like my landscape there. It's like there's a lot of diversity in Africa. And I also point out that Africa is not unique in this sense in any ways, too. We have to point out that across the globe, since what political scientists call the third wave of democratization, it's sort of like the return of democracies from the late 1970s, lots of countries have this sort of variety of regimes out there, like from Latin America to South Asia. And across the globe, too, we've noticed these kind of trends of democratic decline over the past years in established democracies, but also in, again, established autocracies.
Thank you. Who else would like to tackle that one?
I mean, I can add to that. You've laid out the landscape very brilliantly. I wrote a paragraph here that I'm going to just read out and maybe flesh it out a little bit. And this is in response to your question about anxieties about paternalism and whatnot. I say, if there's anything worse than being accused of paternalism, it is refraining from insisting on saying what we know to be right or leveling a particular criticism so as to avoid being accused of paternalism or neocolonialism. Calling out a dictatorial and repressive regime is not neocolonialism. It is a moral and political imperative. If there's anything worse than paternalism, it is condescension. And that's my own message to those of us who study Africa, those of us who are Africanists, non-Africans, but who care about the future of African countries. If there's anything, I think this is the moment to hold the feet of certain regimes, some of the ones that Jonathan has gestured at, to hold their feet to the fire. The last thing you want to do is to refuse to do so simply because, well, it's an African country, I'm not an African, I am of this particular pigmentation. I don't want to risk being accused of, X, Y, Z. When you do that, you're actually not helping Africans. I think the thing that is actually worth keeping in mind is that you want to think not just about regime preservation, you want to think about how Africans think about those regimes. And I say that as someone who got a lot of pushback when I described President Traore of Burkina Faso. I called him a scoundrel. And somebody said, oh, why? That's really, I'm like, no, I was just being charitable. It's worse than that. I said, I grew up under the military in Nigeria, and I know what it means to have the military in power. It's the last thing you want to happen to any society that you care about. And I see all these guys gallivanting across the Sahel, draping themselves with the flag of sovereignty and neocolonialism. And I know it's a ruse, and that these are charlatans. And I think there's nothing wrong if you really care about regimes in Africa. It's one thing to do what Jonathan is doing, which is to historicize, to say that the problems that African countries face are also problems that other societies face. But we don't mince words when we speak about other regimes. And you're hearing that from someone who accused President Trump of cultural vandalism. If I can accuse the president of my country, the United States, of being a cultural vandal, how can I call an African scoundrel a scoundrel? So I think the long and short of there is what is sauce for the goose outside Africa should be sauce for the gander in Africa. Refraining from doing that is not actually the right way to go. We should do whatever we think is right, forgetting about fears of being accused of paternalism. Because once you don't do that and then you condescend, I think that's worse.
I can go since I have points that kind of connect to these two speakers. I think first it's important to acknowledge that most of the younger population, especially in countries like Cameroon or Uganda, have only known one president. And under the current systems, a lot of them do feel like democracy as a system does not work, because that's all they've known for 30, 40 years. And that also, in some ways, point out maybe they aren't eager to democratic values in terms of like freedom of expression. So I think there's that weird space where they're like, democracy is not work. The current democratic system that we have seen as implemented on the continent is not working, but they are looking for those democratic values and how they can in some ways act on those democratic values. The second point I was gonna make is in my conversations with some of the younger Africans, both on the continent but also in the diaspora, there was an interesting, maybe alarming trend that comes where when they're talking about the systems that are changing, they talk about Lumumba, they talk about Sankara, they talk about Gaddafi, and they talk about Traore as part of the same lineage of revolutionary actors. And looking at Lumumba and Sankara, you're like, okay, we can understand why. But when you add Gaddafi and when you add Traore in some ways, there was that conversation of like, why is that the case? Why are they talking about that, especially in that revolutionary legacy? I think, as I said, the question is why, especially at this moment when we know that the Sahel region with the coups are not going to produce that democratic values that a lot of them are aspiring for. And I think the deeper question here is, what does it say about the current system that we have in place in Africa? And most importantly, what does it say about the current generation of future leaders when that is the reality that they are confronting and that's the reality that they're putting out there? I don't know if that's helpful.
You're on.
All right. Is it okay? Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. Yeah. Building on that, I think there is a deeper legitimacy crisis in many African nations right now. And speaking on this on Central Sahel region, which is where my research is based, you look at actors like Chani in Niger, you look at Goïta in Mali, and Traoré in Burkina Faso. You are absolutely right. I think many young people in this generation are looking at them as revolutionaries. And pushing back a little bit against what Ebenezer was saying, I think that these actors who emerge after the coups across the Sahel between 2020 and 2023, they have been using an anti-Western rhetoric. And that anti-Western rhetoric is working because the average citizen in these countries were dissatisfied with Western influence. And so now comes these leaders, these new leaders that are saying, you know, the old model is not working. And Africans need to be independent and need to be able to decide what their future is going to look like. Right now, that rhetoric is working, and they have, on some level, have been delivering something different than the old leaders, civilian leaders, were delivering. Now, this is not an endorsement of Traoré. It's not an endorsement of Goïta or Tchiani. It's saying that what they're saying right now is resonating with the people. And talking about authoritarianism, yes, some of them are authoritarian regimes. Then again, the world is experiencing so many authoritarian democracies right now. And so I think it will take some time before we can accurately determine whether these models would work or not.
Let me add a few things here too, from some of the polling, kind of building on some of the comments. Some of the like bright notes too, as well, is that despite declining levels of satisfaction with democracy, most people across the continent still sport some form of democratic governance in principle. That's really important because there was always debate about these alternative models to democracy, and I think across the Sahel there's some sort of recognition of that, like the military strongmen, and the Sahel is a unique set of conditions of challenging states and human insecurity that contribute to these perceptions that we should suspend democracy in favor of somebody who can get a job done. But the model used to be like the Ethiopia or Rwanda model, used to be held out as why can't we have sort of a benevolent type of authoritarian leader like Paul Kagame in Rwanda or like the PRDF in Ethiopia. And I think that's lost some of its luster, especially since the civil conflict in Ethiopia a little bit since then. And another thing that really matters across the continent, and if you'd like to hear what panelists think about this, is certain norms matter here. In getting countries, again, not on perfect trajectories, right? But like I said, the map is diverse, even though the trajectories are kind of the same, but we have countries that are starting at different conditions. Like there's democratic dissatisfaction in South Africa, even though that's more of an established democracy, and there's democratic dissatisfaction in Cameroon, even though that is clearly not a democracy. One is the norm of turnover, right? The countries that experience turnover and able to entrench that as an important norm. Conflicts over term limits are really, really important across Africa in getting countries on different trajectories. And I think and norms about the use of violence during elections too. And it's like the bright kind of moments of last year was the election in Senegal. And the election in Senegal was in the context of Macky Sall was approaching his sort of end of his second term, and he had promised when he became elected, because he became elected when the former president decided to run controversially for a third term and promised, I will never do that, and then he started to toy with a third term, and then he tried to suspend legislative elections, and people turned out to the streets. There was some violence, but again, the norms of use of violence in Senegal, it's not in that political history. And there's been a generational change in Senegal in leadership, like basically an outsider type of candidate, a youth candidate. Actually, the actual presidential candidate, Ousmane Sonko, was jailed by Macky Sall and then released, and now he's the prime minister. And that is sort of a bright moment of that there's a potential in Senegal. Again, there's all kinds of factors in Senegal that are going to make it very difficult for this new youthful type of democracy to achieve what it wants for younger citizens. But I think we should be aware of that as well, as sort of like that there are underlying starting conditions here. Getting turnover is very, very important.
Well, I think we could probably just talk all day about the challenges of democracy, and interesting to think of that in terms also of neocolonialism as well. So those are really interesting answers. Perhaps we can build on those if the students have questions.
Can I say
later on.
something quickly about
go ahead, of course.
the whole question of alternative model of democracy? I find it's never failed to strike me that each time somebody says, let's have an alternative, the person is always saying, I don't want elections. The press should not be free. There should not be freedom of thought. And if you're a member of the opposition, it's my way or the highway. So that's not an alternative to democracy. That's full-blown autocracy.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's move on to the next set of questions. And again, hopefully we'll get back to these questions about democracy. I think this is important, not just for Africa, but really the entire world, including the country that we're in right now. I'd like to ask some questions that relate to civil society, religion, and the public sphere. And Dr. Obadare, I don't think we deliberately made this question just for you, but we might have.
I think you did. Yeah.
So
You're trying to draw me out.
it's very possible. Anyway, the question that I would like to ask is faith-based organizations, ethnic associations, and grassroots movements often fill governance gaps where the state is absent or predatory. How can we understand the relationship between this informal civil life and formal political institutions in Africa? And does the vitality of civil society indicate state failure rather than democratic health?
Some questions again.
I feel it, and I'm going to turn it to you, Dr. Obadare.
Yeah, I
feel
think
like
this is
you know
one
the answer.
that we can all contribute to from our different standpoints. I think the basic philosophical concept of civil society is the idea of an autonomous realm that is vital, that is vigorous, and that is notionally distinct from the state. And insofar as you have all these groups mobilizing on the basis of ethnicity, religion, or whatever, insofar as that speaks to a particular dynamism outside the state, I think it should be everything that points to the vigorousness of independent social life should be celebrated. Having said that, I think it's worth keeping in mind that, one, there are things that are best left to the state because they can only be accomplished by the state, just as there are things best left to civil society because, properly speaking, they belong within the domain of civil society. Civil society needs a robust and healthy state, just as a state needs a robust and healthy civil society. Both work together. If you have a society that is extremely vigorous and a state that is relatively atrophied, then there is disequilibrium. As much as possible, you want a sense of equilibrium. The final thing I would like to say is that I think it's worth keeping in mind, and I say this as a student of civil society, that even as we celebrate the idea and the principle behind civil society, I think it's worth keeping in mind that it's not a normative paradise. There are all kinds of things also going on within civil society that are not politically or morally palatable. And I think it's worth keeping those things in mind, especially if you are a student of religious groups and religion and politics, you come across things that give you a pause. And I think even as we celebrate the fact that this is a sphere of life that complements and that is outside the state, we should also be wary of valorizing it.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, building on what Obadare, Ebenezer is fine. Okay, building on what Ebenezer was saying, I absolutely agree. I think civil society can either signals the health of democracy, or in some ways it can kind of be filling the void when there are weak states. Take the example of Cameroon, for example. So if anyone who knows anything about the history of Cameroon, it was colonized by the German before World War I. And at the end of World War I, it was reclaimed, it was claimed and divided between the French and the British. And the majority of the territory is French, Francophone, speaks French, follows the French civil law, and so on and so forth. And there is a section of the northeastern region of Cameroon that's mostly Anglophone. That's where the British were based. And since 1960, when Cameroon gained independence, the country has been divided between the Anglophone and the Francophone side, right? And Paul Biya has not done much, really, to reconcile the two. And every so often, there are conflicts that erupt between the Francophones and the Anglophones in that region of Cameroon. And the Catholic Church, as a civil society organization, and Catholic leaders have been the ones who have been uniting and mediating those conflicts. In that sense, the civil society has been playing a very positive role in reconciling the population. On the flip side of that, you take Cote d'Ivoire, for example, my country. At the end of the 2010-2011 election, we had a second civil war, and it was actually religious leaders in the community who were dividing people, who were name-calling, who were saying it's the other side, it's the Northerners, it's the Muslims. So I think sometimes civil society can be captured by religious or actors, mostly political entrepreneurs that are trying to capitalize on conflict. And so I think I really agree with you. I think that they go hand in hand. You need to have strong state institutions in order to be able to have a thriving civil society, and the flip side is true as well.
So I focus on conflict-based areas or active conflict area. And what at least I have seen is that civil society filled a capacity gap because of the failure or the weakness of the state. And there was a question about the legitimacy of those civil society when it comes to them then playing the role the state is supposed to play on a local level. But there's also a question about the legitimacy in the sense of, in some areas, for civil society to exist, they have to report to the governments. They have to be approved by the national governments. So it is creating an interesting problem in the sense of you're like, then those states are just in some ways failing, or they are accepting the non-actions because they know that civil society are going to kind of jump in and do the work the state is supposed to do, right? And I think in some ways that creates a feedback loop where the state is like, then we're not really going to do anything because we know that the civil society are doing it, but then the civil society does not necessarily have the fundings the state supposedly has to do the work. And I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings about institutions like USAID and the role on the continent. But from the ground, USAID played an essential role in creating an environment where civil society working with USAID could do good work. I was talking to several people recently who talked about how their first interaction with America as a concept was through USAID. That's the first thing they knew about the US in a soft power positive lens. And through that work, they were able to also help their community. So there's an interesting space there, I think, that goes back to the question before about external actors within that space. But just summary, there's a massive capacity gap when it comes to conflict area where civil society has to step up and do the work because the states are not doing it. And they rely on that relationship for inactions.
To echo a point here, civil society, in political science at least, is just one of the most slipperiest concepts that's out there. Like we want to pin all our hopes and dreams on civil society. We imbue it with a lot of value. And so I don't think there's one answer to this question, right? It's all very context-driven. And one of the key kind of points of reference, there's a political scientist called Sherry Berman who wrote an important piece about how the Nazi Party used civil society to come to power, to infiltrate civil society, to spread very anti-democratic ideals to come to power. And so civil society is not neutral, right? It's all context-based. So it's all these things. Like civil society can be a sign of state failure. It can be a tale of state offshoring, and all states do that. They decide what's the state going to provide versus what are nonprofits, religious organizations, and civil society going to provide. The United States makes these decisions all the time as well, and African countries make these countries. And one that I work in Senegal, for instance, the former President Macky Sall wanted to unroll a cash transfer program around the country very, very quickly. And he wanted to reach 400,000 households very quickly, but there was no state apparatus to do that. So he partnered with local nonprofits and civil society to become the implementers of this program. It's not a state institution by any means, and that was basically subcontracting. Civil society were key in the movement towards multi-party elections and democracy across Africa, from church leaders to labor leaders to student associations. And at the same time, then civil society is filling this gap where the state recedes or the state is atrophied. And so there's no one answer to this, like, because civil society its meaning is also just contextual. and based on the specific history of the case, the specific nature of that civil society that we're talking about. And so it becomes like a very difficult question to answer.
I think this is such an interesting problem, again, bigger than Africa. I'm thinking, as you've been talking about the IRA in Northern Ireland, the Taliban in Afghanistan, other organizations, I think, Mr. So, you called them political entrepreneurs, jumping in and taking advantage of the opportunity to fill in gaps. On the other hand, we really want a robust faith-based organizations and other kinds of civil organizations, and figuring out how to do that right is another challenge. Perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about this in a little more depth, too. I want to move on to the next question, though, and this is about memory and reconciliation. Dr. Kurasenga McLeod, I think this is kind of directed at you. I'm just going to kind of put you on the spot because I think you're our expert here, but let me just read the question for you. From the legacies of Rwanda's genocide to ongoing violence in the Sahel and the Eastern DRC, African societies are navigating the tension between pursuing justice and achieving reconciliation. What frameworks, legal, cultural, or political, have proven most effective in building durable peace, and whose voices tend to be marginalized in transitional justice processes? Easy.
I need to write a dissertation on that specific question. That's all I have to say.
Give us the cliff notes.
Okay, so there was an easy answer, and then there was a complex answer. The easy answer is some of the most successful transitional justice mechanism have included very specific cultural and context-centered like truth reconciliation commissions, right? And you can think about South Africa, or you can think about the Somalia framework. There is also the aspect of that local traditional mechanism that we have seen in the Gacaca Code, for example, in Rwanda. And there is that understanding that transitional justice cannot function if there's no inclusion. So if we don't include young male in the conversation through DDR programs, or just women who tend to be the primary victims of conflict. And on the continent, one of the framework that's been kind of coming back over and over is kind of that Ubuntu-informed peace building. That's the very easy kind of answer. The problem is most of those have not necessarily worked. If they had worked, we would not be here really talking about it, right? Especially if you add that component of pursuing justice and or achieving reconciliation, those almost feels like they cannot work together. And part of it is that pursuing justice often asks for more of a retributive type of justice and not necessarily a transformative type of justice, right? And in those cases, things like trauma and memories are not really part of the equation. Why? Because they're expensive, and because you cannot address trauma in a 6 months mandate. Like, it takes years and years for that to actually even happen. And the other piece to that also, when it comes to the marginalized communities tend to be the ones that are, I want to use the word performed in the sense of they are put out there as, look at this shiny thing we're doing with these people, but then they are not included in the other processes, right? Women tend to not be included in any formal mechanism. So we look at those marginalized people as the carrots for whatever we really want to do in the background, but without necessarily including them. I have a lot to say. I'm going to stop here.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say that building on that as well, in terms of whose voices tend to be absent from it. I think you're absolutely right. Number one, including in peace processes, is mostly women, children, right? Internally displaced or externally displaced individuals, the diaspora, right? And I think also one other component is the fact that perpetrators and former combatants are often also excluded from these processes. And what that engendered is short-term stability and long-term a breakdown in these processes in the long term as well, because those voices are missing from the conversation, right? So there needs to be this reverberation of conflict as well. Yeah.
I guess I have a question for Claudine about this.
I like that.
Because it's not my area. I mean, I know some of the experimentation across the conflict, and just so like for maybe students don't know, maybe you can talk a little what a Gacaca Court actually was, or DDR is you take armed groups and you disarm them, and then you reintegrate them back into society, often with sometimes a cash incentive. You pay them some money to give up their arms, you pay them some money to go back to their home community. But it seems to me like all these, like the focus on transitional justice. And I've heard it sometimes broken down is that you have retributive justice, which is like jailing people, but the Rwandan post-genocide tribunals are sort of the key example of that. Restitutive justice, which is about airing of grievances sometimes, monetary compensation, and then transformative justice is sort of like usually the last stage, which is about transforming social relations. Is that where a lot of conflict resolution has gotten stuck in Africa? And so my question for Claudine is, how do you separate sort of that process of transitional justice from what the post-conflict political settlement actually looks like, right? So much as this, like in Rwanda, is dictated by the fact that Paul Kagame won the war.
Oh, that's a complicated question.
Puts limits on what is possible, right, in Rwanda?
It does, in the sense of talking about reconciliations and transformative justice inquires imagination of what it could potentially be, and I think it's some level of hope, where when you're talking about creating a system, it's hard to create a system. A positive, peaceful system is hard to bring that hope and bring that kind of imagination into the system, right? And I think this is where I think a multi-level process is needed, where there's and those different levels needs to be in some ways working together, where there's a need to understand that you cannot talk about transformative justice, especially in areas like, for example, in Rwanda, where the perpetrators and the victims were literally sometimes in the same house. So you cannot talk about transformative justice without addressing that root cause of why was your husband willing to kill you for your ethnic identity and things like that. But as you mentioned, in countries like Rwanda, where the system is so heavily dictated by the leader and the party of the leader, then what is the conversation there? What are we talking about when it comes to potentially achieving something that will last longer than the president? This is, I think, a fear a lot of people have in the sense of once President Kagame is out of power, when that happens, what is going to happen in cases like Rwanda, where it's so heavily relying on the president who has been there for 30-some years in all different ways. So I'm not even sure how to answer that question. I think most of us who are in transitional and transformative justice are still trying to figure that out.
Add to that, my own experience. So Nigeria had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was, I think, early in the life of a civilian administration that needed to placate different aspects of society. And I think it was partly in reaction to what was going on in South Africa, Rwanda. Everybody was like, oh, Nigeria should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Of course, everybody said, okay. And then it became a massive jamboree. Everybody was like, it was a moment where everybody thought all the problems of the country were going to be solved. Finally, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But what happened made me think about one part of this question, which is about the legal status of such spectacles. So people came out, lots of questions were asked, there was a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth and all of that. But there was, beyond that, there was a report, and then people just moved on. And I don't know what, looking back now, it's almost 20 years, I can't say this is precisely what that thing achieved. Because it did not have, it was not in the interest of those who mounted it to give it legal teeth, because that would have meant basically disemboweling the very regime that they presided over. And I don't know, maybe it will be different, according to context. It seems to have been very effective in the case of South Africa. The little I know, I may be wrong. Maybe reasonably successful. Yeah, okay. I'm stepping outside my zone of expertise now. But in the case of Nigeria, it never really achieved what people looking inside from outside wanted it to achieve, because there was really no legal framework or to give it that chance of success. So,
just to add on to that, I think it's because in a lot of ways, Truth Reconciliation Commission became another checkbox in the peace building, like toolbox, right? We're like, hey, it's the end of a conflict. We need a truth reconciliation process for the victims, so they feel like they are being heard. And then we need things like the ICC or like the truth reconciliation, ICTR, like in Rwanda, or the YCTR in Bosnia, in the sense of like, we need to show the international community that we pay attention and we take care of our legal international system, right? But this is where I think transformative justice is falling short, because it's, again, a new checkbox we're adding to the toolbox, especially on the African continent, and nothing really is thoughtfully being put together centrally and localized.
Would you agree that it was reasonably successful in the case of Burkina Faso, where the families of the Sankara family, they made sure something happened, Compaore was brought to trial, he was jailed. Isn't that what's
I think in some ways it was working. Honestly, really, one of the only cases where I can think of where it worked very well is Colombia. It's outside of Africa. I think with the historical memory center of Colombia, they actually did the work. They collected evidence on the ground. They talked to thousands and thousands of people. They documented the atrocities, and all of that was included in the transitional justice process, and later on turned into a museum as a living embodiment of what happened, so people wouldn't forget. So I think that's one of the cases of success that I can think of. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's outside Africa.
I think Cambodia did some good job too. Cambodia had localized truth reconciliation-ish system. They didn't want to use the international model. They created their own model, and they had some type of success. But again, it took about 30 years for something to really happen in Cambodia
Absolutely.
too.
Yeah. And then again, in the peace processes, with the 2016 agreement, at the implementation level, a lot of that was ignored. Yeah.
Well, I think I have other questions that I would love to ask our panelists, but we've put so much on the table in such a rich way about democracy, about governance, about civil society and religious institutions, among others, about reconciliation, reconstruction. I want to pause here and give an opportunity for those of you who've been listening in the audience to ask your questions of the panel. So there are microphones here on both sides. I hope that as they've all been, like my mind's been going a million miles an hour up here, are there questions that you all would like to ask? Just step up to the microphone and introduce yourself.
Hello. Oh, it's working.
Yeah.
Okay, good morning. Well, I have been listening to all the panels since yesterday. I'm Javad Dargan, teaching at Middle Eastern History and International Relations or International Studies. And Africa is a continent that I was introduced by a professor from Nigeria during my MA degree. And the first thing she did was to show the map and then insert the United States, China, and Europe onto Africa, and there was still space left. So it's such a big continent. So each time I see anything about Africa, that's the image that comes to mind. And then I was looking at this map, which is colored in a very interesting way. And the first kind of impression that I get was clash of civilization, which was Islam expanding, Christianity expanding, and they kind of meet in the middle. The red area kind of overlaps with that, and thinking of that division, religious division, and the size of the continent and its colonial past. I was kind of curious, where is Africa in terms of its historical stages? We talk about governance, democracy, civil society, conflict, but if we kind of zoom out and try to understand where Africa is in terms of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, where are things in general? If it's possible to talk about Africa as a whole, which I mean, this summit and this presentations indicate that we can talk about Africa as some sort of a unit of analysis. If that is the case, where are we? Is it doing better than 20 years ago overall? Or what are some of the? I think one concept that I was expecting to hear but didn't hear much was colonialism. Are we over with it, or we are tired of talking about it? I mean, I'm more, I know more about Middle East, where colonialism was a more tangential process, but still many of the problems that we talk about in the Middle East is still, when you look from the historical perspective, were kind of shaped through through the interwar colonial experience. And Africa is, of course, the kind of, when we talk about colonialism, that's the place that comes to mind. So where are we in that broader perspective, if that makes sense? Thank you.
So some nice big questions about what is Africa, and
$1 billion question
is colonialism
And-
over?
Is colonialism over?
Who wants to try that
I
one?
thought you had a difficult question. Do you want to go first? Or do
I
you-
could just, again, frame out a little bit, too, because I start with my classes on politics in Africa with these very specific questions as well. Most maps of Africa, of the globe, use what's called the Mercator projection, and that actually makes Africa seem smaller than it actually is. And we have these debates because you think of Africa, and you think Africa is the most linguistically, ethnically, religiously diverse continent on the planet, right? Incredibly diverse, with unique contexts of politics. Things that, Mozambique is fundamentally different than Cote d'Ivoire, right? And so what makes all of this Africa, right, that we call it Africa? What distinguishes, another question, what distinguishes sub-Saharan Africa from Northern Africa as well? And some people don't make that distinction in the way they study things. And that's always a challenging question, sort of what makes Africa Africa? What makes any continent a continent, a region? What are sort of the unifying features? And I don't know what the right answer is for that. I might listen to what my colleagues here say, but I think colonialism has something to do with it, the nature of the colonial experience in Africa, which is debated intellectually what the nature of the colonial experience, but it's different than the experience in India. It's different than the experience in Latin America. It's a later stage of colonialism. In some ways, it's a less intensive form of colonialism, in some ways, in terms of colonial power's willingness to build state capacity in Africa. And what they left behind, and the way colonialism ended in Africa was pretty rapid and sudden at the end of World War II. I think that still has long legs on the African continent, with differences across the Francophone, Portuguese, kind of Lusophone and Anglophone kind of divides here. But there's something about the post-colonial state in Africa that I think is still unique and challenging for all the questions that we're concerned about, whether it's democracy, whether it's development, whether it's conflict. There's something about the nature of the post-colonial state. And one of the things I talk about, no borders have ever been changed in Africa. South Sudan is the only example. I know the next panel there'll be discussions of Pan-Africanism, but those ideas died, like the sort of the Ghanaian Mali kind of federation, those things kind of die out pretty quickly, right? So there's been no challenge to the process of state building that has been there since the 1960s in any kind of fundamental way. We're stuck with these borders, it seems, for the most part. And that presents, again, certain challenges, like maybe my colleagues want to expand on that. The nature of the post-colonial state in Africa is unique. And I could talk about that a lot more, about the nature of colonialism in Africa. There's, again, some great kind of sometimes debates about what the nature of colonialism was in Africa. Was it truly trying to create this hegemonic project to transform Africans into kind of proto-European style citizens, or was it a colonialism on the cheap, basically trying to extract resources with investing the minimum amount of resources from the home countries, and that's why you don't have as dense road networks as you have in India, electrification. Its use of indirect rule is a big kind of consequences there for social relations. It's often seen as something more common in British colonialism to use indirect rule, but French colonialists used it as well. So all those, I think, are still important factors that make Africa, Africa.
Yeah, and I think expanding on that, I want to say that for many Africans, and really talking about sub-Saharan Africa, I think we're still in a liminal space, right? Where if you ask many people, they don't really see those regions as post-colonial Africa, really. They see that we're still in a fight with this disentanglement from former colonial powers. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region, is very resource-rich and capital poor. And that's because if you think about Francophone Africa, for example, when the French left, the economy was still very much entrenched. And we had the control over the extraction of our own resources. The language of unification, so to speak, is still very much French, right? And I think because of all these links that stem from a very fraught past with these Western powers, there are many who still feel as though we're too much linked to the colonial powers. If you look at the decoupling of AES countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso from regional bodies, such as the economic, ECOWAS, if you look at the economic community of West Africa, part of the argument is that ECOWAS is still very much doing the French bidding, for example. And so because we have such links, there is not much of an opportunity for us to determine the trajectory of our countries, how we want to conduct our elections, how we want to conduct our economic activities, and so on. So I think in some ways there is still this decoupling that's happening. I don't think that we have completely delinked from the colonial past, but we're in a liminal space right now.
Frank.
I couldn't disagree more with my colleagues. There's really no time for me to lay out my thinking on this because I know we're running out of time. But there's just so much that I disagree with. Just think about the issue about borders, for instance. One of the things that the Organization of African Union did at its establishment was to say colonial borders have to be sacrosanct. We're not going to change them. That has nothing to do with the colonialists. That was the decision of African leaders to say, here are the borders. To begin to change them is going to cause a lot of pain. We had better leave them as they are. There was a debate at the University of Ibadan, the Ibadan School of History in the 60s about the nature of the colonial enterprise, whether colonialism was just an episode in African history or whether it's something to dwell on. It just worries me that we're fetishizing something that happened within probably 60, 70 years. You're talking about thousands of years of African history, and we're obsessing with something that was so tangential, that's so varied. Portuguese colonialism, compared with German, compared with British, compared with French, that were part of Africa at the high water mark of colonialism that were not even touched by the so-called colonial experience. And it always worries me that anything, when we talk about Africa, we always fall back on this thing about colonial legacy. And I have so much on my mind to say about this, and I don't want to hijack the conversation. But I think the way my colleagues have framed it is totally misguided, and I could not disagree more.
We'll have to continue that conversation later.
I think there's several ways to maybe answer the question. The first one, I think, goes back to what Ebenezer is saying, in the sense of there is an expectation that comes from people, especially non-Africans, to ask Africans, what about colonialism? And I think a lot of us have gone to a point where we know it is there, but we just don't want to start the conversation there because it often maybe undermines some of the interesting paradigms that we're trying to address. But it's kind of the elephant in the room often. We just decide to, in some ways, not look at it and focus on something else. In my Africa Peace and Conflict class, there are different examples that we use to kind of look at what is the context we're looking at when we're talking about Africa. The first one is that you have people right now, older people, still alive who were born under colonialism, right? So for Africa, the system of colonialism is very new. It's still very much in the present. It's not something that was 300 years ago or something like that. We have people alive right now who were born under colonialism. I think that is a reality that we still have to grapple with. And that's a legacy that a lot of the younger generation are still trying to understand in their own understanding of what the reality of Africa is. The second example we talk about is that often we scrutinize Africa and we talk about Africa as non-democratic. They are not there yet. Why aren't they democratic? And we often forget that what France is on its fifth government system. Like, we are asking a continent that literally just in a lot of different ways freed itself to run as fast as we are running as countries that had a more established, longer-term system, democratic system or not, but we have history in this country that led to us being where we are, and we are looking at the backsliding of democratic institutions in this country, and we're asking Africans, hey, why do you have so many authoritarians? Why do you have so many dictators? Why do you have X, Y, and Z? Where Africa, in a lot of ways, is trying to figure what the system is for itself. It's strongly encouraged to go faster. We are giving them models, but they still have, in some ways, to have the agency to figure how to make it happen in the time frame it has. So I think sometimes we have to give Africa as a continent a little bit of grace, because yes, conflict is happening, there's a lot of things happening there, but they're still trying to make it happen. And I think the last then point there is that we have, I think, got to a point where in the analysis that we are making of Africa, we are objectifying Africa in a lot of different ways. And I think we also, as African scholars, are part of that system. A lot of us are educated here in the West. A lot of us has kind of more of a diasporic understanding of what we are looking at. We are doing the same, using all those metrics to look at what's happening in Africa. And that is in some way showing often to the Africans that we are maybe sometimes part of the same problems that we are trying to criticize or trying to shed light on. And we are creating, I think, a system where these questions will need to be answered, both by us here, but also on the continent. And we will all need to be part of a solution, but a solution that is for the African continent, the African people. And I think we need to actually recognize that often.
Thank you. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes left, so hopefully we'll be able to get a couple more questions in. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi. So I had a question pertaining to, you mentioned leaders in African history like Sankara and Lumumba, Traore, and Gaddafi. I was wondering if you think that there currently are or could be leaders in Africa right now who sort of embody many of the, I guess, ideological changes / like changing governments within Africa, that they embodied themselves and had such a strong impact on African history, if you think that's something that is currently happening today or could have the potential to take place.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the last part of that question? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Do you think that that in Africa right now there are leaders like those in the past who would have such a strong impact on sort of the course of history, like Mandela and some of the others I mentioned did?
Does anyone want to talk about good leadership?
So I wouldn't put Mandela in the same boat as those guys. Gaddafi was a dictator. He was in power for 50 years. I don't want to live under a Gaddafi. That's why I moved to the United States. Sankara was a dictator in the making. He was assassinated, right? And that's regrettable. But he was on the wrong path before he was assassinated. When you think about Compaoré and, what's this scoundrel in Burkina Faso, Traore and this, that's not where salvation is. They're scoundrels. You need societies anchored on individual freedom, individual liberty, freedom of speech, equality of sexes, right of people, the governance by popular consent, right? Mandela recognized that. Was in power for one time, he could have had the second time, he handed over. These other guys, you don't put them in the same situation or the same shoes as Mandela. I'm sorry.
Anyone else want to answer that? I think we've got some interesting questions here about, I guess, good leadership in Africa, admirable leaders, but also then I think some important questions about, are we focusing too much on leaders and need to be focusing more on these civil institutions? So go ahead.
Your question is interesting in the sense of why do people do that? And again, he's saying that they probably shouldn't if you're looking at the track record of some of those leaders or what some of them, if they had lived long enough, what their track record could have been based on some of their early actions, right? And I think one of the way I would like to look at it is the way, for example, Traoré dress, the way he present himself is leading people to think about maybe Lumumba or Sankara in his earlier age, in his earlier time, because of, in some ways, maybe the essence of what he's trying to portray, and not necessarily what his policy could potentially look like. And I think this also goes back to why are young Africans so dissatisfied with the status quo they've been living and experiencing, and how in some ways this is them asking for something else, right? And he is presenting something else. It might not be a good version of what Africa could potentially look like, but he is something else, and that's what they're looking for, right? Yes, Gaddafi was not necessarily a good leader, but he created a model, or at least he had aspiration that a lot of people now think that could have been something good that will potentially will have allow Africa to position itself differently than what it is today, right? So I think really at the essence of maybe the question and the way I will respond to it is this is them wanting something different, and this is something different. And is maybe them looking at the fact that some of those leaders they age. They're not 80-year-olds or 70-year-olds who don't want to leave and want to die in power. This is someone new who's saying, framing something different and showing something different. And they just want that.
So it's a challenging question too, but I'll echo some of Ebenezer's language here too. Leadership in Africa today, first of all, the kind of ideological debates of the 1960s are just gone, right? The type of things that framed about African socialism, around Pan-Africanism, these are not the nature of debates on the continent anymore. So your question is like, where are we seeing kind of transformative leadership across the continent? And we're not seeing it. Like, I agree. I think like if you look at leadership across the continent, one thing that stands out, it's old. Second thing that stands out, they're pretty technocratic, right? They view their job as kind of managing the day-to-day of government rather than offering broad visions for their society. And they're pretty bad at their job, too. I think they use that kind of blunt language. Like, there's a real crisis of leadership across the continent. And we talked about the demographic dividend yesterday. I'm not sure most of Africa's geriatric leadership has internalized this quite yet about what this poses for the future of these countries. Like, they're very short-term oriented rather than long-term.
So I'm going to actually take the privilege of being the moderator and ask the last question, if that's okay. Because I think there's some interesting questions. I think a lot of our answers have kind of circled around this question of African agency in all of this. And so I'd like to ask the panel to talk a little bit more about this question of do the solutions to challenges in Africa need to be coming out of Africa? And what is that going to look like if that's the case?
The solutions to African problems are human problems. So they don't have to come from Africa alone. We should get good ideas wherever they come from. That's all. It's a very simple thing. The fact that an idea is indigenous does not make it a good idea.
Anyone else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you on some level. I think that it takes two to tango, right? Which is what we say, right? It's not just about, oh, African solutions have to come from Africa, period, and nobody else can have an opinion on it. But I do think that we need to center more African voices. I think a lot of the literature in academia, right, looking at Africa, looking at China, looking at Russia, great power competition, and so on and so forth, a lot of it has been Eurocentric. A lot of it has been coming out of the West. And we do have African intellectuals as well. We have leaders, community leaders. We have, we do have people who have good ideas, but do we often center those voices? Do we listen to them? I think that's part of the issue. I think we need to elevate more African voices. I'm not saying that we should only have African voices reflecting the issues that we're experiencing or solutions to them, but I think that we need to be at the center of it.
I take the point, but the genealogy of an idea has nothing to do with whether it is sound or not sound.
I would push back.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
An idea might have a European ancestry and be a great idea.
Yeah.
An idea might have an African genealogy and be a rotten idea, and vice versa. The question we should always ask of an idea is, does it conduce to human flourishing? If it conduces to human flourishing, it will work in Africa. Do you see where
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And then again, I think when it comes to politics, when it comes to governance, I think perception is a big part of that, right? And why, again, going back to figures like Traoré, like Goïta, why are they so popular today is because of the perception of who they are. Right, and I think that perception is really important as well. So if you have a generation that's saying we're decoupling, we're trying to decouple from Western influence, from colonial past, and if the ideas that are being centered in terms of ideas to help the continent are mostly coming out of those perceived European powers, then there is a disconnect. There could be some good ideas, but if they're perceived as colonial ideas, that still doesn't help. Right, and I think that we need to work together, Africans and non-Africans, in order to elevate solutions for the continent.
I agree that Africa cannot do it alone because Africa is not isolated, meaning geographically it is, but meaning that it has to play ball with everybody else, and Africa is not going to be allowed to also do that alone. So I think there's a reality that exists. I do agree that good ideas are good ideas. I think it's the implementations of those ideas that matters the most, right? If we're talking about the way our Western, or at least our democratic values will look like on the African continent, it is 50 plus countries with their own history, and a lot of them have not yet been able to move past some of those histories. Thinking about Namibia, still trying to figure with Germany, hey, what the hell are you doing here, right? So there's those conversations that still are much present. I think the problem is the implementations of a lot of those ideas and policies and initiatives that we are creating, hopefully together as Africa and others. And implementation has not been successful in a lot of different ways.
I agree. I think there's a difference between ideas and process and sort of implementation. I mean, if we're going to make this sharp distinction between international and domestic ideas, Africa has a long history of really disastrous domestic ideas, from one-party democracy to African socialism that have just ended up in human misery. But I think that the question, though, of process implementation is definitely more complex. You know, how do we get political elites to internalize that these ideas are right for their societies is a challenging thing.
Okay, I think we are just about out of time. So please join with me in thanking the panel for this very interesting discussion today.
Thank you so much for very dynamic discussions and very insightful kind of information and vision you presented. So thank you so much for your chairing the session, Dr. Gray. So thank you, everyone. We are going to have one more session at 11 a.m. So we're going to discuss great power rivalry and U.S. strategy toward Africa. Thank you so much. See you soon. Hello, everyone. This will be the last session of the 2026 Africa Summit. Dr. Rolly Brucken will chair this second roundtable discussion. Let me introduce him briefly. Dr. Rolly Brucken received his master's and PhD in diplomatic history from the Ohio State University, specializing in the history of international human rights law. For the past 20 years, he was Amnesty International USA's specialist on Zimbabwe, a place he has visited since his junior year of college. He has taught at Norwich University for 25 years, offering classes on nation building, prosecuting human rights abuses, and genocide. Now, I turn it over to Dr. Brucken. Let us give him a round of applause.
I want to thank Dr. Koo, President Broadmeadow, Provost Williams, and the Norwich University Peace and War Center for sponsoring the summit, Africa's Strategic Crossroads, Conflict Governance, and Great Power Rivalry. It's an honor to moderate this panel on great power rivalry and U.S. strategy toward Africa. For 20 years, I served as Amnesty International USA specialist on Zimbabwe. I visited the country, met with politicians, lawyers, journalists, doctors, LGBTQ activists to discuss human rights violations, testified in asylum cases in the U.S., and did crisis response work. Zimbabwe is a great example of great power rivalries. After severing ties with Great Britain and the United States 25 years ago, largely, their current government has worked with Chinese companies to extract gold and diamonds. China is the second largest trade partner for both imports and exports. And the question that to be asked, which we'll ask the panelists with as we get to the continent-wide view, is has this look east policy brought economic or political benefits to the Zimbabwean people and other people in the continent? Let me introduce the panelists, then I'll ask the panelists a few questions and leave up to the audience for the last half an hour to ask their own questions. And we have until 12:15. So let me start with Christopher Faulkner, who's Dr. Christopher Faulkner, an assistant professor of national security affairs in the College of Distance Education at the U.S. Naval War College, where he teaches courses on foreign policy analysis, international security, and irregular warfare. His research examines the behavior of militant groups, private military and security companies, and civil-military relations, with a particular focus on Russian mercenary activity and external security assistance in Africa. Dr. Vitaly Kozyrev is an expert in comparative politics, strategic studies, and Eurasian foreign policy. His major interests are great power rivalries, East-West relations, international conflict, and the political economy of regionalism and regional integration. Faji Komaple is the founder of the famous Rivers Africa Group, an African defense advisory venture. He previously served various assignments during his 20-year U.S. Army career, including combat deployments to Iraq and operational and strategic tours at U.S. Africa Command and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy on Africa. As a decade-long U.S. Foreign Service officer, he focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Joshua Regan is an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at Western New England University. His research primarily focuses on failed states, terrorism, contemporary maritime policy, border security, and patterns of criminal behavior in declining urban neighborhoods. Dr. Robert Vandenberg is a sociologist and criminologist specializing in the study of political violence and a senior fellow at the John and Mary Frances Patton Peace and War Center. He previously taught on the faculty here at Norwich, where he oversaw the creation of academic program in intelligence and crime analysis. If we could give the panel a round of applause. So the first question I'd like to throw out, and reference was made to this book yesterday, one of the most fascinating books I've read in a while. Howard W. French's book, just recently published, The Second Emancipation in Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism and Global Blackness at High Tide, received rave reviews for its portrayal of independent Ghana's first leader. French describes him as a leader with substantial flaws and as a brilliant Pan-Africanist who tried to unite the continent outside of the U.S.-USSR Cold War rivalry. Among African leaders today, who do you see as similarly situated to inspire and navigate the African bloc of nations through contemporary great power challenges to sovereignty and economic exploitation? Sure.
Okay, all right. Thank you. It's a great question, and we need to look at the current situation in Africa and the trend toward some sort of consolidation in the spirit of the Pan-Africanism or the non-alignment movement, even because Africa has been famous for being non-aligned during the Cold War era. So when we look at this question, probably we need to figure out some important dimensions of Pan-Africanism. And I see here the economic dimension, institutional dimension, geopolitical, and integrative in terms of economic integration and also some sort of identity-based integration. And I would probably, it's hard to name a specific leader now, but I would probably start with Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa, who has been a big advocate of geopolitical integration and geopolitical unity of all African states. And so far, he has been very consistent in terms of navigating and balancing between the Western interest and the Chinese interest, the Russian interest, Indian interests in Africa, and his ideas about a specific role and a single voice of Africa on the international scene are very important and very significant. That's my answer.
I think the student question at the end of the last panel, several of the answers that were given was it's difficult to identify a leader that should serve as kind of the steward of the African bloc more generally, whether that's at the United Nations or suggesting consensus at the African Union or something to this degree. So I found it difficult to find one leader that should steward the continent through great power competition, but I think the broad perspective that I could offer is it's selecting between Beijing or Washington or Moscow is not the same as sovereignty. So asserting sovereignty as an independent country or a bloc of countries becomes the key to navigating this multipolar environment that we're operating in. And I'm not sure. I mentioned the point that said we've got, I hate to call them this, dinosaur regimes. Leaders that are maybe disconnected from the demographic dividend that was referenced at the end of last panel, trying to figure out how they represent younger constituencies, and a new frontier for the African continent becomes, I guess it's more of a question or a statement than an answer to your question, but that's where I see challenges ahead for African leadership and opportunities for some of the young African leaders that are emerging. I'm not a Senegalese expert, but I think just looking at the age of the leader, something like 44 years old compared to if you look at something like Republic of Congo, where leaders been in power for 41 years, or Equatorial Guinea's where a similar story, or in Cote d'Ivoire where Ouattara has just been reelected at the end of last year and he's 83 years old. So thinking about young politicians and the opportunity they might have in this new environment to invoke sovereignty and not couch sovereignty as a claim of I'm just picking which great power to partner with. So I'll pause there and.
I guess I'll go next. So first off, I haven't personally read the book yet, but it sounds like a fascinating story about what was going on in this particular African country. And reflecting a little bit on the question and doing some digging, two particular countries kind of jumped out at me. One was Botswana, which is a country that has witnessed a lot of success. Its current president has largely been trying to endorse empowerment of his citizens. He's also trying to expand this principle of self-reliance of its diamond industry and the potential that natural resources could harness in terms of economic growth for the country of Botswana. And the other country that jumped out a little bit with me with this idea of this second emancipation would be Burkina Faso. I read some literature that there's this emphasis and push of trying to mitigate and push out the French influence in that particular country. Dr. Faulkner, you might be able to comment more, because I've seen some literature that ties into now a shift in Russian influence in that, but I'm not sure if you can circle back on that or not.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it my best shot. But when I think about Traore and Burkina Faso, I think that through some conversations with actually some of the other scholars that are here, there's a difference between domestic legitimacy and popularity, and maybe even regional popularity and continental wide. And I don't know the degree to which he's perceived as a legitimate leader by the broader African bloc, if you will. I do think that there is a concerted effort by not just Traore, but Goita and Chiani in Niger to invoke sovereignty and establish some type of resistance to basically Western power specifically dictating their direction, and instead having some agency over institutions, constructing a new institution of security and economic agreement that challenges the old guard of ECOWAS. I think those systems are fragile in their current moment, but that's my best effort to kind of talk about him as a legitimate potential vanguard, if you will, for a new movement.
Yeah, I will take a stab at it, and that's a loaded question. And so before I answer, I need to preface that my answer is in no way an endorsement of the person or his policies. So in my humble opinion, I think Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso best emulate that person who can take up the mantle of Pan-Africanism in Africa. And the reason why I'm saying that is, of course, he doesn't have the charisma or necessarily the intellect or the education of the initial Pan-Africanists. So I'm talking about Nkrumah, the Sékou Touré, the Julius Nyerere. I mean, those people were giant in their time. However, I think because of his youth, he's 38 years old, he's social media savvy, so at least his team is social media savvy. And to some extent, I mean, there's a belief that some of his social media presence is actually boosted by a lot of Russian trolls. So that may be so. But I want to point to a specific event which occurred about a year and a half ago, when during a testimony before Congress, the former AFRICOM commander made a statement as to Traore's alleged corruption, and what ensued was a global social media campaign to defend him, and that led to protests throughout the world, not just in Africa. There were protests in the US, in the Caribbean, I believe even in Europe. And to me, I think that's a clear depiction or demonstration of Pan-Africanism, to have that global reach within the diaspora because of a perceived slight against that leader. So based on that definition alone, I think he's best positioned to be the Pan-Africanist leader on the continent. And then again, in closing, this is in no way me endorsing him or his policies, but just as what I see as a statement of fact.
And when I tried to picture someone in that role, Traore was also the first person that came to my mind. But I also, if I could be permitted to interrogate the question a little bit, I wonder, would it be conducive to African flourishing for there to be a charismatic leader who was the focus of an entire continent? Because we have so many examples throughout history of heads of state who built cults of personality, and usually it didn't go well. There are some outstanding examples of individuals who became embodiments of social movements. I would say Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi are the two that come to mind. But in both instances, they were people who were leading movements in opposition to established power. So the thought of somebody assuming that mantle in the context of also being a political leader with the government behind them, in a post-colonial period, I'm not sure we would actually want that. Although if there's a positive case to be made for it, I'd be very curious to hear it.
Thank you all. Let's talk about China as a relatively new player on the continent. In 2024, China's direct foreign investment in Africa reached US $3.4 billion, up from $320 million 2 decades earlier. I'm familiar with Chinese investment in diamond and gold mines in Zim, which has largely, at least in the research that I've done, not been terribly productive for the Zimbabwean people in particular. But to what extent is China playing the extractive and exploitative role that colonial powers and the United States have played historically, or even continue to today? What is similar and different in terms of China's goals for such investments and effects on African nations and the African workforce?
I'm happy to go first. When you think about China as a global player, they're by far perceived as the largest investor in Africa today, and it all links back to what several scholars have talked about on and off in our discussions over the last couple of days is the emphasis of the Belt and Road Initiative and this multi-trillion-dollar economic plan to invest and enhance and benefit the Chinese economy. And looking at Africa, there's 2 countries that kind of stuck out with me. One was kind of linked to a little bit of what I do in my discipline, which is a focus on maritime piracy, and that country is Djibouti. At one point, China owned 77% of Djibouti's debt. And no surprise that China opened up its very first overseas naval base there in 2017. Why is China flexing its muscle there? Well, it's trying to gain political and economic leverage around the Horn of Africa. And there's other initiatives that they're doing there too, including the expansion of a rail line. The other country that jumped out to me was Angola. Angola has an oil for loan agreement with China. There's more than 150 Chinese-linked businesses that have already invested in the Angola economy, including the construction of a $3.8 billion airport that was largely funded by Chinese corporations. And kind of circling back to this idea of oil for loan agreement, I read one economic study that was showcasing that as much as 1/7 of all oil that is being produced in Angola is being exported to China. So China is becoming this very powerful force in Africa. We had the same discussions at the Peace and War Summit. I talked to Dr. Koo this morning about it with Latin America. And I think the influence of China is something that we should not underestimate from an economic standpoint, but also a national security standpoint.
Continue? Okay. So on the one hand, China's presence looks like, in Africa, looks like an example of colonialism, especially given the Chinese interest in the natural resources and the infrastructure building and the port building of ports and railways across the continent. Also look like they facilitate the extraction of resources. So for many observers, Western and African as well, like China looks like not very much different from a conventional colonial great power getting into the continent. And honestly, many Africans actually perceive Chinese for the last probably 20, 25 years, their activities as also some sort of kind of selfish incursion into the local economies with the where they're bringing like about 1.5 million workforce from China, and this they give jobs and high salaries obviously to the Chinese nationals working in Africa, and we mentioned Angola. Many like cities were built in Angola, and we can see them on Google or like YouTube, some movies about the kind of dead cities, the empty cities, which were built by the Chinese constructing companies, and nobody can afford buying an apartment there. So they just they replicate the Western lifestyle, and only like in a 12-story building, there are 2 apartments purchased by some clients. So there is like an almost empty town. So there is one aspect of this, but another one is that China has really corrected its mistakes and kind of shortcomings of its Belt and Road initiative, Belt and Road strategy, especially after they received some feedback and backlash in terms of not only debt entrapment, but also in terms of like human-centeredness, because they claim that all those economic efforts are actually, in fact, the extrapolation of the Chinese developmental model, and Chinese developmental model is not is considered to be not elite-oriented, but people, like broader community-oriented. So now they have actually shifted their policy of economic modernization or economic assistance, being less conditional, because some people said that it were like non-conditional. The Chinese economic investments were conditional. One first condition was actually as a policy of one China. So you're not supposed, being an African country, not supposed to have anything to do with Taiwan. So there's one first condition which originated earlier, like in the 1980s, 1990s. When China reached out to establish relationship with African nations. And there's been a lot of diplomatic efforts to convince the African nations to switch their orientation toward Taiwan, from Taiwan toward China. But there are other also conditionalities, and I believe that there might be some sort of tacit agreements among the Chinese investors with the local elites and local leadership about the limitation of opportunity for Westerners to come in. And so they try to use political and administrative means to kind of limit competition with Western investors or potential Western competitors. So this is another thing. But overall, the social orientation, the recent emphasis on the utility for the broader community, and you can see the new railways and new roads in Africa built by Chinese. They also all benefit the African population. And the final thing is that the green agenda. So China has been investing very heavily since America stopped purchasing the solar panels from China. So they just now start exporting the solar panels. All of them go to Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia. So Africans actually probably might benefit in terms of building up the green belt and making in energy dependency like less from the hydrocarbons, and maybe doing a little bit more green agenda. Thank you.
I don't have a ton to add to that. There's several overlapping themes that I think are important. I referenced a lot during my talk yesterday about the idea of conditionalities attached to Western security force assistance, for instance. That could also be the same for developmental aid, to the degree that that still exists from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. But the idea of political constraints that kind of mask sovereignty or claims of sovereignty, so things like the Taiwan issue, UN votes over condemning treatment of Uyghur populations, diplomatic recognition. These are kind of I think, sovereignty constraints on African governments, so where we might attach conditionalities in the form of human rights abuses, governance reform structures. China's got a different type of conditionality attached to many of its projects, and whether that's explicit or implicit is a debatable point. The other two things I'd mention is the debt trap, and I think this was kind of referenced already, is trying to figure out ways in which you can renegotiate debt, and China's been smarter in terms of figuring out how to circumvent some of the debt trap concerns that arose with its BRI initiative. not just in Africa, but elsewhere. But I think that the broader point that they're learning lessons and trying to apply them in real time is important. And then one that I would suggest looks maybe connected to Zimbabwe, Zambia, a few other locations, the idea of exporting smart cities. So folks may have heard about this. Technological sophistication, so whether it's investing in telecom infrastructure through major conglomerates like Huawei, but then using some of the data that's collected, exporting that to China in a form of algorithm building for their smart city programs that look like what I think scholars have called data colonialism, that improve surveillance techniques, not only for the CCP, but can also be used for autocratic consolidation. So I think that's a real risk. That's a different form of colonialism, if you will, or a different spin on it that is kind of adapting to the new technological age that we're in.
Thank you. So to what extent is China playing the extractive role? I would say pretty extensively. However, I guess what I need to add is that has always been the case in Africa. A lot of external actors have always played an extractive role. What is different this time around is the language surrounding that extraction that is happening by China, which I mentioned yesterday. It's coded around the language of being able to enable long-term development on the continent by adding value to some of those minerals being extracted, even though that is not happening evenly across the board, but at least the language is there to work toward that point. Because that's been the biggest criticism of extraction in Africa over time, is that for centuries the minerals are extracted and no value is added, so it doesn't create any wealth or jobs on the continent. And AAU and multiple organizations in Africa have come out and lobby for that to change. So that's one thing. So the other point I want to bring up is that in addition to that extraction, which, like I said, has happened over time, what you've seen around this time with China is, in return, you actually seen tangible infrastructure projects that are being put in place, which I mentioned yesterday in response to a question, I believe, from Professor Koo about perception of Chinese involvement in Africa, which according to Afrobarometer is around 60%. The positive, Africans view China mostly in a positive lens. 60% of Africans view China in mostly positive lens. So on that question of extraction in Africa by China, I think we have to look at it clearly as a role that they're playing, but we have to view it as coming with, like I said, that language of being together in this, creating this global community for a shared future for mankind, but also the infrastructure project that's been left behind.
And I feel like this is an area where I need to reiterate my caveat from yesterday, because this is a topic that sort of impinges on U.S. national security policy so much, which is anything I say here is my personal opinion, even though I work for the Department of Defense in my day job. But the short answer, yes. Like I would say Chinese involvement in Africa is very extractive in ways that has colonial overtones. But I also think that in a lot of the conversations about this that happen in the context of Americans discussing U.S. Africa policy and U.S. national security policy, there tends to be kind of a knee-jerk reaction to Chinese involvement on the continent that says anything China does is a net setback for the United States. But I think what gets lost in that conversation is the reason why so many African countries have been willing to partner with China in initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative is because it does answer a very real need that exists on the African continent for more economic development and more transportation infrastructure in particular. And I would not rule out the possibility that China's investment in promoting economic development and employment in Africa could actually benefit the United States indirectly, insofar as it could help realize that demographic dividend and stabilize a lot of these societies that are under significant population pressure. And so I think it requires a very nuanced perspective.
Let me ask a follow-up then, and I appreciate Dr. Kozyrev's talking about conditionality and one of the conditionality seeking to displace Western influence. If you were an advisor to our current president, What policies would you suggest that he follow to respond to this, to increasing Chinese influence in Africa in a way that can maintain American influence, can gain soft power leverage when it needs to act on the continent, and especially above all to help Africans themselves with the challenges that we all have in living in a 21st century world. So what policies would you suggest to our current president that he might follow to meet this moment of increasing Chinese influence?
I would suggest it should be some sort of reassessment of a structural potential, what that American presence or influence or investment might actually make for African society. So each African country should be evaluated separately. It should not be, so we just spoke about Pan-Africanism in terms of like from inside out, but we need to look at each particular situation. That's what we've tried to look into the West African case as a much more like unstable and just vulnerable and risky for Russia and China to actually go and make some like undertakings or like some new endeavors in this region. So I think the first thing is diversification. So it should, and that's what probably the current administration is doing, is trying to be very nuanced in terms of how and with whom to communicate and to promote what kind of initiative. Second is without just the previous neoliberal era conditionality. Do like deregulation, open up for foreign direct investment, should be like targeted investment. For example, if America has enough new innovative technologies in medicine, just go and collaborate with local institutions, organizations, even receive some private non-government support to create a showcase. That's important. That's what I remember I was advising a long time ago in the 1990s for the Russian government trying to attract Japanese investment, and Japanese were very reluctant to invest into Russian Far East. And I spoke with the Japanese saying that, could you just establish one village and just invest into the absolutely like 22nd century technology and show the Russians that you can, right? That it works. And not only Russians, but also two other investors from Japan. And they said, oh, okay. And even the Russians, when after Fukushima, invited the Japanese citizens affected by this radiation to move to Russian Far East, to settle down and just develop like their agricultural farms and something like this. So I think that what America needs to do is to be very concrete, very purposeful, select maybe several areas where America is very strong, and just make a showcase for other nations, for other countries, not necessarily making money at the first stage, because a lot of countries, local African interlocutors are afraid that, okay, America's price, like if America is building a railway, it will be like 3 times more expensive, or like Japanese. I remember there was a discussion in Malaysia. Are we going to join the Belt and Road Initiative and agree on China's high-speed rail or investment, which would be like 3 times cheaper than the Japanese ones, so, right? Or we just go and be politically correct and not very much dependent on China and invite the Siemens or invite the Germans or Japanese. So it was like, so need to create the opportunity for those nations to make a choice and also regulate those, how much money they're going to spend, what the terms. Maybe we can extend the 30-year term of lending and like lend-lease, which America has been famous for. And even today, for example, when Russians are asking themselves, do we hate America? And they said, no, we don't hate America, despite everything, because they have helped us during the Second World War to actually support our effort to actually confront the Nazi German armies. So that's a long run, it's a long shot, right, to actually achieve something in Africa.
Thank you. So to that question, if I were advising the president, I will say that, as just last week, the America First Africa strategy just came out, and I will say that it's a pretty good strategy, in my humble opinion, towards Africa. And the reason I'm saying that is because of the focus towards commercial diplomacy, a move away from aid to trade. And I'm saying those things because, and I'm a lifelong classical liberal, I believe in holding on to some of those ideals that we have been trying to push in Africa for the longest time. However, those things haven't worked. And I think there has to be a way to try to do something different, and that is to deal with the countries and some of the regimes as they are, not as how we wish they were. And I think that's one way to compete with China and Russia in Africa. And I think that pragmatism and that transactional approach, as as shady as they may be to some people, I think that actually resonates with a lot of people in Africa because they view it as clear-eyed, honest, and more direct than some of the former approaches that were in place, where where we push some values and sometimes some of those values are unevenly enforced as well. There were waivers for some countries based on national interests and the likes. So yeah, so in my humble opinion, I think of course there are some blemishes, such as, in my humble opinion, holding back on some humanitarian assistance in exchange for mineral access and things like that. But on balance, I think things are trending in a positive direction.
I should also caveat that I'm speaking in a personal capacity, so the views don't represent my organization or the U.S. federal government, Department of Defense. It's a difficult question. We've seen a strategic retreat in many ways through a lot of the soft power tools that the U.S. had. I would offer a comparative advantage, especially in the realm of great power competition. USAID is the easy one to look at in terms of a soft power tool that has now been gutted or reconfigured in a sense under State Department in ways that are to be determined, and what the path forward looks like. And I think the new Africa strategy is, if I remember correctly, mentioned yesterday as trade, not aid. And so trying to figure out ways in which we incorporate Africa into a international system of globalized trade and things that are mutually beneficial, and that's difficult right now, where it seems to be very transactionally oriented and at times one-dimensional. I would suggest maybe strategically short-sighted. So trying to invoke things that were mentioned yesterday to the administration about building a strategy is about looking beyond the electoral cycle of your own domestic country and trying to think about building sustainable investment in the continent is one way. The first Trump administration, for instance, had Prosper Africa, which was a specific program designed to increase U.S. trade with the continent through private sector investment. I believe that was housed under USAID, and so programs that get caught up in soft power tools that we've had that may be defunct now, thinking about ways to revive those that fit directly with the Africa strategy that they've proposed. I think are just some potential areas that we have opportunity to pivot towards.
Yeah, if I had the opportunity to advise the president, I would encourage him to take the long view and to focus on the theme of enlightened self-interest, because with the African population growing so very, very quickly, it creates a scenario where the flourishing of Africa is deeply entwined with global stability and, by extension, the welfare of the United States. And so it's actually inherently to our advantage that the economies of African countries grow fast enough to keep up with their population growth. And one really easy way to facilitate that, I think, would be to look at our trade with a lot of these countries and see what we can do to minimize tariff barriers or other trade barriers to African commodities entering the U.S. market. Because by and large, most of these African economies are producing goods that are further down the value chain than the United States. And so they're not competing head-to-head with a lot of our own manufacturers. But allowing those goods to be sold to American consumers with as few barriers as possible creates a scenario where, without having to allocate government money or government effort, we are creating a scenario that stimulates their economic growth and provides more employment opportunities for African workers.
So one of the themes that was brought up over and over throughout the last 2 days is that when people think of Africa, they think of a continent of poverty. They think of it filled with corruption. They think of it with civil conflict. And sorry if I'm jumping into the last question, but this kind of links into my thoughts. And I think you have to look at the perception of what the region itself has to offer and the potential that the region has to offer. In terms of just research potential, there's estimates to be $2.5 trillion worth of resources in sub-Saharan Africa. And reflecting on that, I think if I were to offer guidance to the current administration, I would offer the guidance of looking at things of Rome wasn't built in a day, and we have to think of our approaches from a largely humanistic lens. And I believe in this idea that trade policies, which was mentioned, right, this idea of trade, exchange and trade for aid, has prospects to help grow the region, and a successful Africa will correlate with a successful America.
Let me finish up on this subject before going to the audience. If I was being cynical, which I'm not, because I'm a hopeful person, but if I'm cynical about the new U.S. strategy toward Africa of trade and aid, one might read it as a justification for reducing soft power, USAID being one example. Certainly some of the language by some of our diplomats toward Africa has a lot to be desired. And if it is a justification, another reading, right, justification for offsourcing U.S. foreign policy to American business interests, what are some of the, if you accept that reading, and I'm not asking you to, but if you do, what are the costs, both to this country and to the people of Africa, of U.S. political and diplomatic disengagement from the continent?
So I wouldn't call it a diplomatic disengagement. I will, again, I'm prefacing, I'm speaking in personal capacity here, of clearly not carrying the water for the administration. But from what I see, I think it's just a shift in focus. And I've been working on Africa for the last 15 years, for the most part, and I've seen strategies, the first one coming from the Obama administration, which was very much about pushing for democratization, respect for human rights, and from what I recall, humanitarian assistance. But then again, like I said, those pillars were only selectively enforced. And it's also, some of these issues are very much high on the Maslow's pyramid of needs. So if you're talking about a region where some of the basic needs are about trading and getting something out of what you're trading with, I think, so as a result, I think this approach makes sense. So I don't call it a disengagement. Of course, when it was unveiled last week, it talked about mentioning pushing for these efforts on the continent through embassies. The commercial diplomacy, for example, will create what they call deal teams at embassies within the political and economic sections, and they will facilitate U.S. business access in those countries. So as far as the continent itself, the effects on the population, so I was just in a region over the last couple of weeks, and just talking to, of course, this is just anecdote, but I think the transactional and nature of these kind of engagement appeal to people because you know what you're dealing with here. You don't have to worry about, what is a policy based on democratization? What does it really mean? Is the country going to get a waiver or be sanctioned for having fair and open elections? Some of those things, whereas you can actually see a business deal being signed with a U.S. company to, build something, a telecommunication system or a road or something, things of that nature. So as far as the population is concerned, I think a transactional approach will be more effective, in my humble opinion.
I'm probably going to not answer the question, but do my best to follow on. We hear a lot of, you want to be the partner of choice. This is kind of a recurring mantra across administrations. How does the United States become the partner of choice? And it's not exclusive to the African AOR. I think that the point on transactionalism is an important one, especially if it resonates with local populations, that there is a clear, there's no dependency focus on this transactionalism, trade, not aid kind of mantra that's been invoked. And I might scope out to say, I think that that maybe permeates into other sectors besides just the economic sphere. Anecdotal as well, but speaking with some higher ranking military officers in some certain countries that suggest, you know, their idea is we are open for business. And I referenced this yesterday of not having to pick one great power to work with and instead having legitimate sovereignty and agency over who you choose to partner with. Figuring out how the United States competes there is a difficult question, but one that is worthwhile for the administration to continue to pursue. I think the difficult part, as I see it, is someone like China, if we just look through that lens, having significant state-owned enterprises to kind of dictate where you go and invest, where the U.S. is trying to convince and leverage private sector investment. That's difficult to solve, and there's a whole bunch of different risk assessment reasons that private corporations may not pursue opportunities on the continent. So thinking about working with allies and partners to make more stable or structurally acceptable investments, I'll call it burden sharing in the private sector, if you will, could be an opportunity that we could look for. But I think that's the one comparative advantage that China has over the United States, and I don't know that anyone's solved that yet, but it's clear that the current administration is trying to work to craft a domestic tolerance or interest in private sector investment on the continent. Whether that comes to fruition, I think, remains to be seen.
Before you respond, if folks want to come to the microphone now, because we'll go to the audience after we're done with this question, just to save time. So feel free to line up at the microphones on either side.
Yeah, I appreciate how you articulated the premise of the question, because I wouldn't necessarily say I share the premise, but if I did, I think one of my chief concerns would be for programs such as PEPFAR, President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. I think I got the acronym right, which is, well, one of, if not the most successful humanitarian programs in the history of U.S. foreign policy. It would be an interesting debate how it compares to the Marshall Plan. They're from different eras, but there's no question that PEPFAR, over the course of the past almost quarter century, not only saved a tremendous number of lives in Africa and elsewhere in the world and countries affected by HIV/AIDS, but also brought the United States a tremendous amount of goodwill. And if you go look at a document that the State Department recently published called the America First Global Health Strategy, there's a very, very persuasive paragraph in there about the benefits of PEPFAR, not only in the field of humanitarian relief, but also national security, and how by improving the health climate in many of these countries, the United States also contributed to improving the security climate. And it's not stated in the report, but I would say if the health benefits are the primary benefit and then the security benefits are the secondary benefit, there's a tertiary benefit for trade because business is best when people aren't dying. And so if we were in a situation with a very dramatic shift away from aid and in the direction of pure business, I would say remember programs like PEPFAR, and in particular how they might seem fuzzy and touchy-feely at first glance, but they're actually good for the business climate.
I personally, I kind of echo some of the thoughts of the other speakers. I'm going to actually, if it's okay with you, I'm going to yield my time just so in case we have appropriate time for the Q&A. Want to hear what some other questions from the audience. But if you want to comment, that's like perfectly fine with me.
No, they will just start speaking Chinese instead of English. So that's my answer.
Thank you for the panel. Great presentations. I have two questions, both incidentally about language. So, extraction. The logic of the colonial enterprise was extractive. So extraction means I go into your country, I put a gun to your head, and then I take what you have. That's extraction. when China trades with country X, so over a critical mineral, pays for it after a negotiation, how is that extraction? If two agents agree about the value of a particular product, the price of that product, and trade is affected, how is that extraction? And why is the onus on China to provide value after completing a trade? Why is it not right for China to say, I've paid you for what I'm taking, and I'm walking away? Why is it the business of China or the US or whatever country to make sure that African countries spend their money the right way? That's one. Second, debt trap. If you sign a deal regarding a particular loan, right? So you say, oh, I'm borrowing $500,000 from you, and the terms are set, and you sign on the dotted line. How am I exactly trapping you? Where is the trap? The language is clear to both parties, and you sign on to it. Where is the trap there? Thank you.
So I'll have to disagree with you here, because I guess based on my understanding, extraction is the process of removing something. So you can talk about extraction of oil, even in the Middle East. I believe what you mean is exploitation, which is essentially the act of coercing someone or a country to remove their minerals without paying them their due fees. So extraction can occur anywhere. I mean, even here in the US, a mining company going to the Midwest or wherever, drilling for oil, that's an extractive industry activity. I don't think we talked about exploitation per se. So with regard to China, if I recall, the first question was about Chinese extractive activities. I don't think anyone equated that to exploitation, unless I'm mistaken.
I've got nothing right now.
Okay, so my understanding is of this is if you just use Mali, for example, to extract uranium and just bring uranium to France or to Russia to further enrich, that's extraction, even if you pay for this. That's why the Chinese government has been very now nuanced in terms of how to incorporate those countries, and including the subjects, the companies in these countries, to actually incorporate them and elevate their role in the value chain. That's important. That's why after this we'll stop calling this extraction, right? Two cases, Russia and Kazakhstan. So when China said to Kazakhstan, oh, we just like to do the industrial capacity network, so we will now just remove our most dirty production on your territory. Can you agree? Are you okay? We'll pay you money. And Kazakhstan said no. If you want to just do something, bring us technologies and incorporate us in your value chains, right? Russians, China said, oh, we are going to buy your natural gas. And the Russians said, okay, but if you invest into our oil refinery, to make a much more high quality and added value product, we are opening up markets for you. So I think that something similar should be achieved and reachable in terms of African collaboration with those especially China. Maybe I didn't understand correctly your question, but that's what my impression.
I'll try the second one on debt trap. I think you make a valid point. Terms of contracts, I don't pretend to know all the details of several of the examples. I think the one that most have latched onto outside of the continent has been in Sri Lanka, where a deep water port was built. China was granted a 99-year lease, and you can't make good on the payment. China seizes said asset. So that's the typical debt trap diplomacy that has been invoked. And I think several folks have mentioned that it's maybe a little bit overblown. And so I I don't have a good example on the continent where this is existing, and I think that Vitaly's point on the opportunities for renegotiation or creativity when it comes to inabilities to service debt that might happen for an African state, that China has shown a willingness to use diplomacy and renegotiation as a tool of statecraft to ensure that debt trap diplomacy isn't what they're leading with. So I think you're right. There's agency here, right? When you sign, and who's to dictate and say that this isn't a sovereign choice? I may be agreeing with you more than answering a question or disagreeing, but yeah, maybe that's all to say that I think it's been contested heavily, that it's slightly overblown. On the exploitation question, this is an unformulated thought here in terms of other forms of ways in which extraction can be exploitative outside of just, we're buying something at a discounted rate. What several states, I'll reference Mali with the Russians, for instance, have been quite successful at trying to ensure revenue sharing. I'll call it nationalizing the gold industry, so making sure mining contracts are win-wins for the mining corporations, but also for the government. Not every country has done that in terms of revenue sharing for extractive industries. And then the other issue is, slightly outside of my wheelhouse, but environmental degradation. So a form of exploitation where China has limited type of regulatory frameworks for mining that can be consequential long-term for sustainability or environmental conditions in the regions in which they've participated. I'm not suggesting that the U.S. and the West has perfected that regulatory framework either, but I think that is a form of exploitation that China potentially has an advantage with through leading without regulation. So,
excuse me. And in general, I don't like this extraction word. I always remind me of toothache and tooth extraction. So I agree with you that extraction is probably not a good term.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna, sorry, I'm just gonna comment on the debt trap point. Hopefully I'm not stirring the pot here. I just look at things from slightly from a different lens, perhaps. I mean, that's the beauty of social sciences and academia. We all have our different viewpoints and perspectives. And if you look at some classic and case examples of the Belt and Road Initiative, they're primarily, not overall every single country, but largely they have targeted those countries with either a resource or geopolitical advantages for China, and more importantly, countries that are in debt, and they know that those countries can't pay back that debt. So in a way, I mean, it's this exchange for a resource or property or infrastructure establishment with this principle that it's going to help benefit one party more than another. In some instances, I'm optimistic that this infrastructure will long-term generate some economic growth. We've seen that in other parts of the world. I know Pakistan has started to benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative programs, but from an academic lens, I kind of stand by this perception that in some ways it is kind of a debt trap.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Please excuse my ignorance on the topic. I'm very interested in a quick history or overview or anecdotes of the work that the African Union has done in terms of instances of collective legislation when it comes to policies. For example, creating initiatives like complementary public investment for infrastructure based off of some of these mining contracts. If that has happened, and from the world systems theory perspective, do we look to see protectionist policies coming from the African Union as beneficial, even though it's creating a slower development time frame, that being the positive of there being a maintaining of domestic destiny when it comes to building those states? Thank you.
Repeat the last question.
Yes. From the perspective of world systems theory and globalization, international trade, do we have an opinion with a slower development through protectionist policies coming from the African Union if it means that the continent gets to decide its own destiny? Thank you.
All right, I'll try to tackle that one. And yeah, please, you don't have to apologize. I think that question is very much me personally as well. And I know, thank God the ambassador is not here today, but I personally view the AU as very opaque in terms of their activities. It's my belief, I don't believe they do have a collective legislative mandate because, yes, of course, it is a supranational entity. However, it is more of a collection of states and head of states actually meeting once a year. Again, good thing the ambassador is not here because I'm picking on the AU. But I mean, unless somebody here can correct me, I think to date they have not yet passed any legislation or any action that is binding for all nation states to follow. So that's the first question. For the second one, for the world systems theory, I guess I have to go back to my grad school days, which I believe is it's more of a left-leaning theory that views the world as divided in three spheres, right? The core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery, with the West being the core and Africa being out on the periphery to be exploited. So it's very much a theory that I think speaks to a lot of people, especially in the Pan-Africanist community, because it is very much, it very much has this framework of the oppressed and the oppressor, and that within this framework, that Africa will never be able to develop unless it pulls itself away completely from that. So, to some extent, I think it's a very difficult question to answer because of the fact that the world is so intertwined with globalization these days that I cannot even conceive a situation in which Africa pulls itself away from those linkages that have been established for centuries to fully close itself up. And I believe the term is import-export substitution process of just closing everything up, bringing in machinery and develop yourself. And then once your industries are strong enough, start trading with the world. I mean, it will be almost impossible for me to imagine. So I think now we're left with a situation where, in my humble opinion, Africa just has to deal with the card that's been dealt, which is relying on the actors that I talked about yesterday, the West on one end, and then China and Russia on the other end, to try to get the best deal it can from these interactions to create the conditions for development in Africa. I hope I've answered those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you going back to grad school with world system theory. That was one of my minor fields in grad school also, but thank you, yeah.
I might just comment briefly on the AU. I'm going to butcher this, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that was passed maybe in, I don't think it was 5 to 6 years ago. My deficiency here is essentially trying to increase intra-continental trade by lowering trade barriers, so things like tariffs that have been in the news, right, trying to make this a coalition. Obviously, the African Union, I can't remember how many member states. I feel like it was clearly a majority, but I don't know the exact number. But I think this is one of these instances where we've seen efforts by the AU to codify meaningful progress towards economic development. I think that's kind of where your first question was going. I can speak from a security lens, other efforts by the AU to revisit some it's not legislation, but frameworks or agreements. The Convention on the Elimination of Mercenaries was passed in 1977 and 2019, so I think around the same time that this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement was adopted. You saw an effort by the peace and security architecture of the AU to update what this framework looked like to address contemporary security challenges, specifically in terms of external intervention on the continent. So there have been muscle movements that have taken place. I think they're still in their early stages. And so whether or not they codify into meaningful development or security changes on the continent is kind of remains to be seen. But you know, you don't have to look that far back into history to look at how the COVID pandemic impacted globalization writ large. And so having increased intra-continental trade is a valuable prospect for future challenges where the world's cut off because of a man-made issue or because of a pandemic or because of conflict. So I think that those efforts have been laudable, but probably too premature to judge whether they've been successful.
Thank you so much.
I would just comment that I think everything needs to take a balanced approach with the AU. I mean, obviously, infrastructure is critical, but we think about Africa, we got the civil conflict and the importance of the AU's initiative with peacekeeping. We got talked a little bit about healthcare and the importance of healthcare, social programs. It's just, there's multiple pieces of the puzzle, and we have to take a balanced approach and just progress forward with each of these simultaneously, which is a very daunting task.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. So my question stems from conversations I had with Dr. Obadari and the ambassador yesterday. I think it was unanimous between the three of us that as Africans, we use the term Africa contextually, because we keep saying African security, but I think everyone in the room can acknowledge that we don't treat Estonia and Portugal as having sort of the same security issues. And so even when we say Europe, it's very contextual. So my question is, the African continent has 54 states, thousands of languages and regions, but it has practically no infrastructural integration. I mean, as a Nigerian, if I wanted to fly to Tanzania, I'd have to go to Europe first. And we've also seen external powers, for lack of a better word, how they approached or how they tackled Pan-Africanists. Quite simply, history has shown that, and most recently, even with Gaddafi. I mean, he was a dictator for decades, but as soon as he started to advocate for an African currency, it certainly became a problem. I think in part because it affected sort of the external financial architecture that is prevalent in the continent. But yeah, my question is sort of trying to get an American perspective. I know that you're not speaking for your institutions, but as individuals and as experts, who does the category African security actually serve analytically? Is it a genuine unit of analysis, or is it an intellectual convenience treating the continent as sort of one manageable problem as against separate realities?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the African Union constituted its own Peace and Security Council, so they seem to find the category useful to some extent. Now, granted, the security environment in a place like Djibouti is very, very different from a place like Botswana, so there's tremendous heterogeneity, especially dealing with a continent that's 5 times the size of the contiguous United States. So the point about heterogeneity is well taken, but I think one of the values that the category serves is when you have a continent that has been subject to external intervention for so long, it creates a heading where you can say, okay, what are the range of challenges on this continent, and then what would it take to empower the people who are actually native to this continent to address those problems on their own rather than being subject to external intervention. And so, and my understanding is organizations like the AU were created largely with that mission in mind. And so I understand why one might wish to interrogate the category, but I do think there is real value to the category in that respect.
I don't have anything to add. Sorry.
There are different aspects of security, and I agree with my colleague that actually for Africa, we need to probably, because nobody is going to use missiles against, like, launching against, so that's what, like, it's unimaginable against any of African states. So most of the security issues are like intra-continental. So we need to look at the security. If we speak about the security architecture, it should be some sort of pan-African security consensus about how to deal with each other, like how to protect sovereignty, how to solve territorial disputes, because there are some still territorial problems given the colonial legacy and the frontiers and borders drawn by the French or British. So this should be some sort of multilateral dialogue to develop some principles of Pan-African security. And thanks God, it hasn't been gotten into the problems of developing nuclear weapons and missiles, because I'm kind of more concerned about Eurasian security, and I try to actually make a parallel or extrapolate certain issues on Africa, and hopefully Africa will not encounter those problems in the near future.
I don't know if I'm going to do a sufficient job of answering your question, but I think your point about not treating the continent as a homogeneous entity is an important one. Some of the points that have been referenced about regional security architectures that could be valuable for the different problem sets that maybe a region or a group of states face is an important one, and I think we've seen that organically develop with some external support. The Gulf of Guinea architecture for addressing IUU fishing has been, I think most would suggest, a beaming success of African agency over regional security architecture. And so I think there are clear pieces of evidence that would suggest that there are opportunities that exist and templates that are available to achieve that. I don't know if I'm actually getting at your question, but I'm going off of one of the points that the gentleman just made before me. The other is, thinking about, I'll reference the Sahel, and so thinking about the way in which Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have constructed the Alliance of Sahel States to try to figure out how to get at a problem set that I think that they identified as, for a bunch of different reasons, not a priority for the ECOWAS bloc. And so that's maybe their narrative as well, and maybe I'm buying into it a little bit too much, but I think there's an element here where you've seen efforts by states, and these in particular, to reject the status quo in ways that and invoke sovereignty and autonomy over the security threats that they face, looking for partners that are willing to partner with them in the truest sense, as opposed to partners that are dictating the terms of that partnership. And so, yeah, that's kind of where my head goes of thinking about some of the security challenges, but it maybe speaks to your broader point of the need to focus specifically on the problem sets that each individual country is facing, as opposed to categorizing it as an African problem. So
we have less than 3 minutes left, and so I would like I know we had at least 2 unanswered questions. If the panelists, after we're done, if you could stick around for a minute or 2 to answer those 2 questions, if those folks can stick around. Can we give the panelists a round of applause? I want to thank you for your expertise and for your time, and I want to thank the audience for coming and hopefully taking away some things to think about.
Thank you so much again. Over the past 2 days, through insightful presentations and discussions, we had the valuable opportunity to expand and deepen our understanding of key African issues, also many other global issues as well. We are living in as we know, we are living in an exceptionally challenging global geopolitical environment. As a current and future leaders and global citizens, we are called to deepen and broaden our perspective, understanding of African issues as we have discussed over past 2 days, as well as many other global topics as well. As we see in the Middle Eastern region right now, it is really catastrophic. The war is ongoing. Russia-Ukraine also, 4 years have been witnessing the terrible war and potential risk of China-Taiwan kind of contingency. So many different kind of challenges we face. So as a future leaders, I really want you to broaden and just to deepen your understanding, and then you can make a great contribution to this challenging world. So, distinguished speakers and guests, thank you so much for your wonderful contributions in debate and sometimes heated debate. So at this point, we conclude the 2026 Africa Summit at Norwich University. Thank you all for your participation, whether in person or online. Hope you have a nice day and see you at the next year's Peace and War Summit. Thank you so much again. Yeah.